5 fractures that killed the Ottoman Empire. In 1529, the Ottoman Empire laid siege to Vienna, and half of Christian Europe spent the next year sleeping in armor. A century and a half later, the situation had flipped so far that Russia could have marched into Constantinople and ended the empire on a Tuesday afternoon. The only thing stopping them was that Britain and France found a crumbling Ottoman Empire more useful than a dead one. European diplomats had a name for the question of what to do with the carcass when it finally dropped. They called it the Eastern Question, as if dismembering an empire of 25 million people were a household chore nobody wanted to deal with. How does an empire that once terrified half the world end up surviving on the charity of its rivals? Ottoman Empire history usually tells you about the glory. This is the story of how every system that built it broke. 5 separate systems broke at different speeds, and each crack made the next one inevitable. Military, economics, politics, reform, imperial. By the time World War I delivered the official cause of death, the Ottoman Empire had been a morgue for over a century. Nobody had bothered to bury it. For 2 centuries, the Ottoman war machine ran on 2 advantages that made it almost unbeatable: cannons and janissaries. The Ottomans professionalized artillery long before anyone in Europe organized a proper gun corps. Their bronze cannons, cast in a single piece, outranged and outlasted the wrought iron tubes most Europeans were firing. In 1453, Mehmed Sar rolled up to Constantinople with a 26-foot bombardment so loud villagers got a day's warning, and he did not just break the walls. He broke the idea that walls could defend cities at all. The Janissaries were the other half of the formula, the first modern standing army in Europe. Christian boys conscripted from the Balkans, converted, trained year-round, bound to the Sultan with a discipline no feudal levy could match. Europe neutralized both advantages equally. It caught up. By the mid-1500s, European armies had professional artillery of their own, plus a new toy in smaller, faster field guns that humiliated Ottoman siege artillery in open battle. The Star Fort, with its angled bastions, turned Ottoman breaching tactics into an expensive form of failure. The Ottomans kept showing up with the 1453 playbook while everyone else had moved on. The Janissaries rotted from the inside. Recruitment loosened, positions became hereditary, the corps swelled from 10,000 to over 50,000, and the average quality fell off a cliff. At the Siege of Cutton in 1621, 100,000 Ottoman troops could not beat 40,000 Poles. The Sultan blamed the Janissaries for the defeat. They killed him. This became a habit. The Janissaries assassinated at least 2 sultans and deposed several more every time someone tried to reform them. The empire's greatest military asset became its primary domestic threat, a standing army that refused to fight foreigners and made a side career of fighting its own emperor. The economy went next. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire sat on the most expensive real estate on the planet, the bridge between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Spices and silk flowed through Ottoman customs houses, and the empire taxed everything that moved. 2 events in the late 1400s ended that arrangement. Vasco da Gama rounded Africa, and within a generation more than 3/4 of Europe's pepper was coming through Lisbon instead of Aleppo. Then Spanish galleons dragged the center of world commerce into the Atlantic, leaving Ottoman cities as geographic backwaters in real time. Spain also began extracting industrial quantities of silver from the New World, and Ottoman currency happened to be on a silver standard. Cheap silver flooded in, the value of Ottoman money collapsed, and prices rose roughly 5-fold over the next century. That is the textbook profile of hyperinflation, and nobody in the palace had the framework to even diagnose it. The Janissaries revolted when their wages stopped buying bread. The Sultan raised their pay, and then executed his own treasurer to appease them. The empire had built its wealth on a geographic monopoly, and the rest of the world routed around it. The Ottoman court was engineered to manufacture instability. European monarchies followed one inheritance rule: the eldest legitimate son gets the throne. The Ottomans had a different rule. When the Sultan died, his sons fought it out, and the strongest candidate was supposed to win. This worked for a Turkic tribe of a few thousand. For an empire of 25 million, it produced civil war on a generational schedule. Mehmed II patched the problem in the 1400s with the fratricide rule, which allowed any new sultan to legally execute every one of his brothers on his coronation day. It worked, in the sense that it prevented civil wars. Mehmed III applied the policy to its mathematical limit and strangled 19 brothers at once. Still the largest mass fratricide in Ottoman history, and probably anyone's. Selim the Saint died in 1574 with his heir Murad away from the capital, and Murad's mother was terrified another son would claim the throne first. She hid her dead husband's body in an ice chest for 12 days and waited for Murad to ride in. An empire spanning 3 continents, and the succession turned on whether one widow could keep a corpse cold enough. The eventual reform was worse. Later, sultans stopped killing the princes and started locking them away in luxurious apartments with no education, no political experience, and almost no human contact. Mustafa I emerged from that confinement, took the throne, and spent his reign pulling his advisors' beards and searching the palace for his dead nephew. History remembers him as Mustafa the Mad. On top of all this sat the harem, a parallel government of up to 500 people where the sultan's mother, his consorts, and the eunuchs who controlled access to him fought over appointments and policy. The chief eunuch ran pieces of a continent-wide bureaucracy because he held a key to the right bedroom. The Ottoman political system manufactured problems faster than anyone could solve them. If you're finding this kind of systemic breakdown useful, hit subscribe. I map these fractures across history and current events every week. So here's the cruelest paradox. The empire needed reform to survive, but every reform made it weaker. With the military rotten, the economy bleeding, and the politics a Baroque hostage situation, any functioning state reforms. The Ottomans tried. Selim III took the throne in 1789, the same year Paris stormed the Bastille. He built a new European-style army to replace the Janissaries. The Janissaries deposed him and had him murdered in prison. Mahmud II spent 2 decades building a loyal counterforce, then in 1826 turned it on the Janissaries in what the court named the Auspicious Incident. About 6,000 died in a single afternoon, and he abolished the corps that night. Then came the Tanzimat. 4 decades of reform starting in 1839, centralized taxation, legal equality across religions, modern conscription, European schools, railways, telegraphs, a new navy. The empire borrowed enormous sums from European banks to pay for it. Istanbul started looking faintly like Vienna. By 1876, the Ottoman Empire defaulted on its sovereign debt. European creditors responded by creating the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a foreign-controlled body that collected Ottoman taxes directly and shipped the revenue to London and Paris. An empire that could no longer collect its own taxes inside its own borders. The reforms also detonated their own constituency. Conservative Muslims rejected legal equality with Christians. Christians could pay a fee to skip conscription. Muslims could not. A program designed to unify the empire pulled it apart. The empire needed reform to survive, but lacked the institutional strength to survive reform. Like performing surgery on a patient too weak for anesthesia. The procedure might be right, but the patient still dies on the table. By the late 1700s, the Ottoman Empire was alive only because the other great powers preferred it that way. Russia could have marched into Constantinople several times. Britain and France blocked them, because a Russian-controlled Bosporus would have torn up the European balance of power. The Ottomans existed at the pleasure of London, Paris, and St. Petersburg. European chancelleries called this the Eastern Question, a polite phrase for who got which province after the funeral. They were arguing over the inheritance while the patient still drew breath. Nationalism was eating the empire from the inside at the same time. Serbia rebelled in 1804, Greece in 1821. Unable to put down the Greek revolt alone, the Ottomans called on Egypt, technically a province and practically an independent state. Egyptian troops massacred Greek civilians at a scale that turned European public opinion against the Sultan. British, French, and Russian fleets sailed into the Bay of Navarino and destroyed the entire Ottoman navy in an afternoon. Greece won independence and province after province followed. Then came World War I. The Ottomans did not want it. They picked Germany. Germany lost. The Allied powers carved the empire into the borders that still define the Middle East today, including some of the lines still on fire. World War I did not kill the Ottoman Empire. It signed the death certificate of a state that had been functionally dead for a century. The Great War was a formality. So now we have the full picture. 5 fractures converging, a military that could not defend the borders, an economy that could not pay for a military even if it had one, a political system that could not make coherent decisions about either problem, a reform program that turned every fix into a new wound, and an imperial structure where every neighbor was already picking through the estate. Here is the pattern most people miss. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse. It degraded. Collapse is dramatic. An explosion, a revolution, a single catastrophic event. Degradation is quieter. Systems rot in parallel. Each one fails a little more each decade, and each failure accelerates the next. The empire lost the capacity to fight in the 1600s. the capacity to pay in the 1700s, the capacity to govern by the 1800s, and the capacity to reform by the time reform was the only option left. By 1914, it was a sovereign state in name only, a flag, a throne, and a collection of borders that other people were already redrawing. This is why infrastructure is now a security policy. A gas pipeline can create dependence, a rail line can move troops, an electricity grid can determine whether a country survives pressure. The Ottoman Empire is not just history, it is a warning about what happens when every system you depend on starts failing at once. And the people in charge keep arguing about which fracture to fix while the whole structure comes down. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more videos mapping how history shapes modern power. Was the Ottoman Empire killed by World War I? Or was the Great War just the funeral for something that died a century earlier? Let me know in the comments.